Okay, well, it seems like people are arriving for the talk, so I'll just start with the introductory material, and then once that's finished, we'll be able to get started. So thank you, everybody, for coming. This is the first in the semester's Clever Planets seminar series. My name is Duncan Keller. I'm a postdoc with Sinti Lee and Raj Dasgupta in the Clever Planets group. And just to give everybody an expectation, these are about 40-minute talks with then maybe about 15 minutes for questions. Please refrain from speaking up during the talk. Instead, you can put your questions in the Q&A section. You can type that out, and we'll go through at the end and go through the questions. You can also at the end raise your Zoom hand if you'd like to ask a question and speak in that way. These talks are pending the approval of the speaker, recorded and then posted to the Clever Planets YouTube channel, where you can find a record of most of the past talks. I'll just say a few quick words about the Clever Planets group. Clever Planets is a multi-institutional interdisciplinary initiative to unravel the conditions of planetary habitability in our solar system and beyond. Its lead institution is Rice University, and it's supported by NASA as one of the teams in the Nexus for Exoplanetary System Science Coordination Network under astrobiology. We also have a land acknowledgement. Our research at Rice University is pursued on the traditional lands of several native peoples, namely the Karankawas and the Sanas, as well as the Coahuiltecans, represented today by the Tap Pilam Coahuiltecan Nation, and the Ishaks, represented today by the Atakapa Ishak Nation. We see it as our duty to acknowledge this historical aspect of our identity and to foster a beneficial environment for all communities, in particular, those who preceded us on this land. Today's speaker is Dr. Margaret Landis. Dr. Landis received her PhD from the University of Arizona and currently works at the University of Colorado Boulder's Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics. She has published on a variety of aspects of volatiles in our solar system's rocky bodies, including as part of the team that detected H2O on the surface of Sirius. With that, Margaret, please share your screen, and we're all looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction, and let me get these slides started here. Okay, thanks so much everyone for the introduction and for the invitation to speak today. So I'm going to be talking about a slightly different and closer to home airless body than Ceres today. Looking
Margaret,
at
we are not seeing the screen at least. Sorry.
Okay. Try this again. Is that any better?
Yeah, that's good.
All good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I just included another introductory slide, even though thank you very much, Duncan, for the introduction. Yeah, so generally, if it is a rocky or solid surface in the solar system and it has ice on it, I think I'm interested in it generally. I did my PhD, as was mentioned, at University of Arizona I finished in 2018, and there I was part of the HiRISE and Dawn spacecraft teams. I did my first postdoc working with the gamma ray neutron detector on Dawn. So some non-EM spectrum remote sensing there. And then I joined LASP as a research scientist in June of 2019. And then of course, promptly was affected by the pandemic. So it's really fun coming back into the office and not being quite sure who people are, even though I've been here for 3 years. I am a Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter team member. And one really exciting thing that happened this summer is I was a science co-I on the selected Lunar VISE PRISM mission. So I'm really excited to get more into some lunar science, which is what I'm here to talk about today. So there are some places in the solar system that are really unique because they have permanently shattered or persistently shattered regions. Mercury has them. This is based on obliquity. And so basically, if you take your standard billiard ball assumption of a planet and add topography to it, if the obliquity is low enough, there's places on those poles of that planet that are really shadowed, and depending upon how much topography there is, depends upon how deeply shadowed. Fortunately, there are impacts that frequently happen in our solar system, and so a lot of these planets with solid surfaces have impact craters near the poles that get much colder than the surrounding topography and can host a variety of volatiles. So just looking in the inner solar system here, Mercury, the Moon, and Ceres all have relatively low obliquities. Ceres changes significantly over time, so that's a little bit more challenging. But in the present day, all three of these solid surface bodies in the inner solar system or in the asteroid belt have regions that are incredibly dark, where direct illumination of the surface basically doesn't occur. You get some infrared scattering, but not a lot. And these are long-term volatile traps. And so for the Moon, one reason this is interesting is because we might have water there, we might have other volatiles in addition to those as well. So this is not uncommon, statistically speaking, in the inner solar system, but the volatiles that we find in these areas are potentially really interesting. Yeah, then Venus has low obliquity, but who knows about Venus because it's very hot there. Okay, and so the reason we care about lunar volatiles is that we don't know currently with a definitive answer what the source of the lunar volatiles are. They could have been delivered by comets or due to interior outgassing the Moon itself early on in lunar history. And so potentially we have a record of volatile delivery to the Earth itself, which is very interesting from a terrestrial habitability standpoint, but also potentially how volatiles in the inner solar system and on rocky bodies generally work. We have this competition potentially between external sources like comets and asteroids versus interior outgassing. And part of the challenge here is that, and one of the bigger kind of solar system architecture questions is that it's not definitive whether inner solar system volatiles were redelivered post planet formation or they were due to interior outgassing or some likely kind of combination of both. And so one of the reasons we're interested in lunar volatiles is it might provide this Rosetta Stone for understanding how volatiles work in airless bodies or just in planets in general in the inner solar system. And so there's kind of two ways of thinking about polar volatiles in general. One of them is the case of Mercury, where, like I mentioned earlier, Mercury has a very low obliquity. There are these spectacular radar bright areas that were later confirmed with messenger data to be volatiles. Of course, this is Mercury, so what's volatile on Mercury isn't necessarily something that we consider volatile on the Earth. But in this case, these radar bright areas did correspond to potentially large deposits of volatiles on Mercury. And what's interesting about those is that the lifetime of some of these volatiles on Mercury is short enough that probably this is due to a delivery from a large impact at some point in time. So Mercury is kind of this one extreme example where the permanently or persistently shadowed regions of the poles are filled with kind of a one-off event or maybe multiple one-off events late in solar system history. The other extreme is Mars's North Polar layer deposits, which this is one of my favorite ice sheets in the solar system. So of course I had to show a photo of it from Mars Global Surveyor. So this is the other kind of extreme case where Mars's volatiles and water are potentially primordial. They've been cycled through multiple different systems in an atmosphere multiple times. And you have deposition at the poles that is controlled by local climate and local atmospheric conditions. And so these kind of two extremes, Mercury and Mars, we want to understand where the Moon fits in. Was the Moon and lunar volatiles delivered by a couple of large one-off events that fill these permanently shadowed regions? Or is there some sort of like interior process or interaction with a potentially tenuous lunar exosphere that had something to do with this? Oh, and before I transition into talking about where lunar polar volatiles potentially came from, since this is a group that is concerned with habitability and evolution of planets outside of our own solar system, this is a really critical thing because even if we don't think the Moon was ever particularly hospitable to microorganisms or other life forms, this gets at fundamental questions about what kind of planetary scale processes produce volatiles and produce water and potentially produce conditions that could eventually have some sort of self-replicating complex molecule in them. So even if the Moon is not crawling intentionally with microbes or other things. I think the Apollo astronauts did leave. They weren't exactly the most planetary protection minded era in space exploration. So there might still be some things there, but the moon generally has very large temperature extremes and is probably not overall hospitable, but understanding how rocky bodies evolve and kind of collect volatiles from the surroundings means that it's kind of fundamentally a laboratory for understanding how these processes would work on the Earth. It also helps that it's right next to the Earth and has a very similar impact history. Okay, so kind of breaking down what I alluded to earlier, there's 3 potential mechanisms for volatile delivery or concentration to the lunar poles. The first one is lunar volcanism. So these 2 figures are from a Needham and Kring 2017 paper. And what they did is they mapped the lunar mare in terms of different epochs of basaltic mare volcanism, where you have these large flood basalts and potentially very large outgassing events that occur along with them. They mapped kind of the relative age in the succession of deposits on the lunar mare, and then came up with a idea of how much first of all, volume was erupted, and then how much mass of different volatiles were potentially obtained. And so there's this huge spike 3.5 billion years ago. And then basically in the recent past, it has been negligible compared to that spike, even though there are kind of these later episodes of mare volcanism that could have contributed additional volatiles. Another thing to note here is that the volatiles they're looking at are not primarily water. The water is this dashed line, which is not a whole lot of mass compared to other things. But we have carbon monoxide and sulfur species that are also largely contributing to these volatiles. So what we get with lunar volcanism is episodic, but episodic very early in lunar history, eruptions of water, but also accompanied by CO and S. So if these were volatiles that were delivered to the lunar poles, it would make sense that sulfur and CO would also accompany the water. The next hypothesis is solar wind implantation and sputtering. So this was proposed kind of mid in lunar polar volatile exploration and kind of quantified by Morgan Szymanski in 1991. The idea is that solar wind and solar wind protons are constantly bombarding the lunar surface. And so you have essentially chemistry occur because of the interaction with the solar wind and minerals on the surface. And so this is kind of like the extreme space weather version, where you get a lot of OH, and then that can relatively easily recombine with a proton or with another H that's floating around and turn into water. And then of course, these will be transported to the poles, where these permanently shattered regions are much colder. One thing we know about solar wind implantation and sputtering is, and this actually ties into something later as well, but we know this is happening. The moon exists in a solar wind environment. And so this mechanism is occurring, and it's occurring over like the entire solid surface lifetime of the moon. And then finally, again, kind of the Mercury example, but kind of the fun one, especially from my work with Ceres, is this idea that the moon has been, the moon has been impacted by things. That's how it got its craters from other places in the solar system. There's this idea that comet and asteroid impacts might be able to deliver water, but also organics. So this chart here on the right is from a review paper from 2011 that shows the range of measured values in red, the number of comets in black, and then all of this normalized to water. And so of course, water is 100% relative abundance, but then you have relatively large relative abundances, but less than water of CO and CO2. And then your favorite carbon including species are here as well as a little bit of H2S. So you can't really escape. H2S is also released from volcanism, but the distinguishing characteristic here is that volcanism is going to be producing a lot of these sulfur compounds relative to water, whereas comets and asteroids probably are going to have less. And so this is a mechanism that could have, again, delivered water to the moon and to the Earth. And one thing that's been really interesting in the last several decades is the discovery of made about comets and these really hydrated asteroids, or hydrated icy asteroids, really begs the question if all the water has to come from the outer solar system or in cometary sources or not. There's a lot of evidence that icy objects were kind of injected into the asteroid belt at some time, which really speaks to this much more complex exchange of water in the solar system than potentially just predictions of ice lines might suggest. So that's really cool. And so, like I alluded to earlier, all these processes are plausible. Like we know that lunar volcanism occurred. We know that solar wind is happening, and we know that things have impacted the moon. So the moon could be a Rosetta Stone for understanding how volatiles will deliver to the Earth, either through outgassing of rocky bodies, understanding how that works, or cometary delivery. And part of this is that we're talking about different time frames here. Lunar volcanism was quite old compared to, and shut off compared to cometary delivery. So this really also depends upon the age of the PSRs and when these things formed. And to give kind of a quick background here for early polar volatile exploration, theoretical work suggested that there should be volatiles stable on the moon. It's always fun to pull a paper from the 60s and see Bruce Murray's name appear. But one thing that is kind of important here is that this is not unexpected that there might be some places on the moon where volatiles would be stable over long periods of time. Also, if water is going to be stable, there was a lot of more early theoretical work that suggested other volatiles might be stable, including one of my favorite paper titles of all time, Don't Drink the Water. This paper from a researcher at Argonne National Lab suggested that if you're finding water on the moon, you should also be finding mercury, which if you send an astronaut with a straw, they're going to be not just drinking water, they're going to be consuming things that are also potentially dangerous. But this also means that lunar polar volatiles might record the trace volatiles that were delivered with the water, and those are diagnostic for the potential source. Are these borne out by samples? Did we find a whole bunch of hydration with Apollo? Unfortunately not. A lot of the Apollo samples are consistent with basaltic and volcanic mineralogy without a whole lot of water. So this was kind of a letdown in the 60s because we had, I guess, the collective lunar science community, we had hoped to find some traces of water since we knew it could be stable. But they were anhydrous. One thing that's important to note, though, is that other places in the solar system, like carbonaceous chondrites, we do see water and heavy metals co-occurring. So the whole "don't drink the water" paper was onto something. It's just that it was not borne out by the Apollo samples. And then in the late 90s, there were some suggestions that maybe the moon was hydrated again, or at least had water ice with the Clementine bistatic radar experiment. Circular polarization ratios tended to suggest that there was some sort of attenuating material in these shadowed regions shown here in these figures from the North and South Pole. And of course, the hypothesis was water is a really good radar attenuator. So this is kind of thinking back to those radar results for Mercury, even though these Clementine data were taken before those data. Also in the late 90s, Lunar Prospector, which was a neutron spectrometer, suggested the presence of a strong neutron scattering material at the lunar poles, which again is likely water ice because hydrogen is a really great thing to kind of change the number of neutron flux, or to reduce the neutron flux that you receive. So all of these data, including measurements spectrally, in addition to radar and neutrons, suggest that there are places on the moon that have surface hydrogen in the present day. One thing that's really interesting is, unfortunately, the Sophia Airborne Observatory is not going to be flying for much longer. But one recent paper suggested that they actually, with Sophia, found hydration spectral features on the daylit side of the moon. So even though the Apollo samples didn't find a lot of structural water, there's all these lines of evidence from just every single type of remote sensing you can imagine that suggests there's hydrogen or hydrated material on the surface of the moon. The big game changer, though, and of course, being an LRO team member and a diviner instrument person, I have to say that LRO was also a huge paradigm shift in our understanding. The L-cross impact demonstrated that in Cabeus crater. You could even tell exactly where the L-cross impact happened because you can see the smoking hot crater in Diviner. So we know exactly where the L-cross impact occurred, and we can see that pretty definitively the amount of water after the impact far exceeds the pre-impact average from detections in the plume. So we know that there's volatiles in, this is the rim of Cabeus crater. It's incredibly cold. It's one of the classic permanently shadowed regions on the lunar South Pole. And there's water there. A spent rocket that hit the moon found it. So that's good, but that's again one site. To expand this study a little bit more, other instruments on LRO and other remote sensing techniques, including the Lyman alpha mapping shown here in the left, and again, mini RFs, another generation of radar shown on the right, is showing that things that are consistent with high differences in the on alpha beta ratio for the Lyman alpha data and for circular polarization for the radar data suggest there's some sort of icy material at the lunar poles in these locations. One thing that's also interesting is that not all of the coldest places show these Lyman alpha positive detections of volatiles. So that's weird. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. And finally, next generation neutrons. Again, you have this reduction in neutron count rates the closer you get to the lunar poles, which is a classic sign of there being some sort of buried hydrogen. The other thing with neutrons I didn't mention when I showed the LEND results is they're sensitive to about the upper meter of material. And so the neutrons are looking at the upper meter, and then depending upon what wavelength you have for the other remote sensing, you're looking at the upper microns to maybe centimeters of material. With thermal data, you're actually looking at the diurnal skin depth, but we'll get to thermal data in a second. And I'm still showing this image because I think it's funny, even if we don't do as many forehead temperature checks now as we did back in 2020 when I gave a version of this talk. But one thing that I have done is look at the diviner data. And so diviner is basically taking the moon's temperature, but instead of using a handheld thermometer, it uses a radiometer. Again, this is on LRO and has been collecting data from 2009 to the present. And one thing that's really impressive about that is it's more than a decade of temperature data. And if you're looking at things that vary in time, that might have variations based on local time coverage and other things, having a really long temperature baseline is really great when you're looking for maximum and average temperatures. So basically keep LRO and MRO lights on for as long as possible. A little bit of background on how diviner works. There's 9 different channels. Each of them are sensitive to a different wavelength range. And what you can do then is measure the radiance in that wavelength range derived from the surface and convert to a bolometric temperature. And you convert to a bolometric temperature by assuming that there's black body radiation, or that the surface of the moon can be modeled as a black body. And then you can basically add up the different radiances you have in different channels to understand what the temperature curve looks like. This being said, and this is a classic Josh Banfield comment, is that what does temperature on the moon really mean? And so in this case, we're talking about the derived bolometric temperature from the observed radiances. Whether or not you actually went there with a thermometer and measured the regolith, and that would be the temperature you would get, depends. But I think that's an important distinction to make, is that we're inferring temperatures, even though this inference is based on very careful physics and very careful calibration of the instrument. Okay, and so since LRO was launched in 2009, there's early diviner results. This is one of the really cool things about this mission, is that we get actual temperatures of the south pole of the moon. What's shown here in the far left panel is a bolometric temperature map from diviner from the first couple months of data. So there are still data gaps around the outside. So I think these are maximum and minimum temperatures. And then in the right 2 panels, one challenge was that since there wasn't data covering the entire South Pole in the initial few months to year of the mission, teams used thermal models to kind of fill in the gaps. And so the right 2 panels are thermal models, and then on the far right panel is depth to where ice would be predicted to be stable. So the white areas are where, from diviner data, Page et al. 2010 predicted water ice would be stable on the surface. And then depending upon how warm to cool the color gets, how deep below the surface it would be stable. So one thing that was particularly revelatory about this diviner measurement back in 2010 is that there's a ton of real estate where within 10 centimeters of the surface, so an easy digging distance, I'm sure a lot of us who have done soil profile pits are like, oh yeah, I can dig a 10-centimeter hole, let's roll. So there's potentially water ice that could be stable in these locations very close to the surface. And so it's accessible, and it might be something that from remote sensing and in situ observations, we might be able to detect. So the study that I've been working on and have published the first half of re-examines this, because we've gotten, at this point, a decade worth of temperature data. And instead of just water, we also know that other trace volatiles are going to be really important for understanding whether or not it is volcanic or cometary origin for these volatiles. So what we looked at in this study was water, of course, sulfur species, organics, and CO2. CO2 really kind of spoils some results, doesn't have a whole lot of stability at the South Pole and almost none in the North. Diviner's spatial footprint is about 300 meters. So what we're thinking about the 300-meter scale rather than necessarily the astronaut or the rover scale. So when we're presenting stability regions, we're thinking about multiple pixels of this like 300-meter data set. So what we were looking at was these primary different groups of species, and we derived stability temperatures to be, or stability from a thermal perspective was defined to be where there would be less than 1 millimeter per billion years of sublimation rate for that particular volatile. And the data set we used was 10 years of diviner data. So these are the maximum bolometric temperatures for the North and South Pole from 60 to 90. One of the reasons we expanded down to 60 is one question we had was, are there areas that are not maybe permanently shadowed, but shadowed enough that they're cold enough for volatiles to be stable? One challenge with sampling permanently shadowed regions is that it's very thermally challenging for whatever in situ observation platform you have to go from the sunlit moon to basically temperatures that sometimes are colder than Pluto. The minimum temperatures on here are in like the 50 Kelvin range, so we're talking pretty cold. And more information on the data processing is in Landis et al. 2022 in Planetary Science Journal. And these maps are also online, so if you want to pull these temperature maps and pick your favorite volatile, if I don't talk about your favorite volatile in this talk, you can also apply the same kind of temperature cutoffs to see where it would be stable. And here's the map for water from 60 to 90. One key way, and this usually goes over pretty well in large conference venues, is that it's pretty hard to see where the blue is. There's a lot near the poles that actually 90 north in both hemispheres, but there's not a whole lot. We're not finding like whole undiscovered swaths of water ice stability outside of about 85 or 80, which is consistent with what we previously thought. But to zoom in, there are some interesting trends. So in the South Pole, again, these deeply shadowed craters very close to the pole have lots of volatile stability area. But then, so this is 80 to 90, but there are still some areas from 80 to 85 where there are little patches of stability, oftentimes inside smaller craters, like this one here, if you can see my cursor, close to 180, kind of on the left-hand side of 180 in the south. The other thing that's interesting about the north is that probably just to the luck of the draw for impact craters, there aren't a whole lot of fresh, deep impact craters close to the North Pole. So a lot of where the volatiles are in the north are along these scarps, especially around 85 degrees north, where these are potentially water ice stability regions that aren't the entire floor of a crater, but are kind of, you could drive up to this cliff potentially with a rover and see what's happening. But there's a lot more, or there's less area, and it's less centered at 90 north in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. And then two zoom up areas I'm going to show in the next slide are shown in A and B here. And these are kind of the extremes of where we expect water ice stability in both hemispheres. So between 80 and 85 north, there are these little patches that fill in smaller impact craters on especially poleward facing ridges. And what's interesting about these smaller topography elements is smaller topography likely formed at a different time, and especially it's formed after the ridge forming event here. So if we go look at smaller water ice stability patches on the moon, we're potentially sampling a different time and a different epoch than, for example, 3.5 billion years ago when lunar volcanism was active. And so taking samples or understanding if there's actually water ice in some of these smaller pockets where it could be stable will tell us something about the origin as well, without necessarily looking into the direct chemistry. And then this one in the south is kind of fun because these are water ice patches that are equatorward of 80 degrees south. And these are in smaller craters on the poleward facing wall of another larger crater. And again, what's interesting with these is we know these smaller craters must postdate the larger crater from just principle of superposition. So these craters are potentially sampling a different volatile era than some of the larger PSRs around it. So again, we're not discovering like vast undiscovered surface water ice stability regions, but we are finding these geologically interesting areas that a future mission could take samples from to really understand, first of all, whether or not there's water present, and if so, what epoch in lunar volatile delivery are we thinking about? Is it volcanism, or is it later delivery from impacts? Or is it consistent with just the moon having been a lithic object in space long enough for solar wind to have produced a lot of water? And then the other volatile species, as promised, this is the map for sulfur species. So we're starting with sulfur in the lightest color, which is the least volatile, also has the most thermal stability predicted range at 202 Kelvin, all the way down to H2S down at 51 Kelvin. H2S is pretty corrosive and pretty toxic. So if you start sampling volatile areas, you kind of want to be sure that you're not going to have like just a puff of H2S appear and corrode your rover. Fortunately, since we're thinking about 51 Kelvin, the areas are pretty small. They're the darkest yellow here at the South Pole, and there really aren't any substantial regions more than a diviner pixel in the north. That being said, small topography roughness elements, of course, can change the exact temperature you're going to measure on the meter or sub-meter scale, but we're talking about long, contiguous diviner footprint scale deposits. One takeaway too, and even though I haven't overprinted water yet on this, I'm going to show that in a couple of slides. Water's surface stability temperature, so less than a millimeter per billion years of sublimation, is about 110 Kelvin, and sulfur's is 202 Kelvin. This means that everywhere on the lunar poles where water ice would be stable, sulfur, so elemental sulfur from lunar volcanism would also be stable. So one potential prediction is that if lunar volcanism really did contribute a significant amount of water to the lunar poles, we should really see a significant amount of sulfur coming with it. And then finally, these are organics. So we are looking at toluene, pentane, hydrogen cyanide was always a cool one. I liked looking at it because it's potentially dangerous to people, but it's also one of those cool things that you potentially could get from comets. And so generally the organics are a little bit more volatile, so their stability temperatures are lower and there's less area for them to be stable, but there are still places, especially in some of these darker PSR or darker, colder PSRs here at the south. Amundsen crater here on the right, it's this Central Peak crater, which is one of my favorite craters for some reasons I'll explain later. There's a variety of volatiles potentially present in the Amundsen permanent shadow. And then also in the north, a lot of these scarps still have a fair amount of area where a variety of volatiles could still be present. It's nowhere near as spatially extensive as in the south, but again, these scarps are potentially really interesting exploration targets in the north and targets of future remote sensing as well. Okay, so what does this mean for a variety of volatiles? So here I've picked sulfur, water, hydrogen cyanide, and CO2 to map. CO2 is in purple and only appears in this middle panel here. I've got one panel from the North Pole zoomed up on one of these scarps, where along these scarps you do see a wide range of potential volatiles. And so if you wanted to go test the relative abundance of sulfur, water, and organics, this cliff in the northern hemisphere has the potential to host all of these volatiles. In the south, again, these classic three craters closest to the pole have a wide variety of volatiles, and actually more variety of volatiles than Shackleton. So this is Shackleton crater. It's gotten a lot of attention because it is almost exactly at the pole, which really feels like a cruel joke on Ernest Shackleton, who didn't actually ever make it to the South Pole for various pretty substantial mitigating reasons. And so the crater that's named after him is also not at the pole, which kind of feels mean, but I was not responsible for naming this one. And so one thing about Shackleton, though, is it doesn't have a lot of large potential area for organics trapping, where some of these other ones do, as well as CO2. So there are a couple of CO2 patches here. Another thing to note is that other work by Shograffer and Williams has suggested much more extensive CO2 ice patches. They kind of interpolate some of the temperature data and try to come up with a best estimate. They also argue that maximum temperature is not necessarily the best indicator of volatile stability. Whereas we picked maximum temperature and we didn't interpolate kind of between maximum temperature measurements because we wanted to pick some of the strictest constraints on where volatiles would be present. So if these volatiles are not present in these locations that we're predicting with this particular configuration of diviner data and volatile kind of cutoff temperatures, then they are probably not there in substantial quantities. And if they're not there, it means that something happened, right? So if you predict that they're there based on the best knowledge of physics and chemistry, and they're not there, that is pretty important. Whereas if you kind of loosen some of the, maybe some of the temperature constraints or use a different data product, you might predict areas maybe instead where the volatiles are metastable and it's not nearly as definitive. So we wanted to pick basically the closest thing we could to approximate to like a treasure map of like X marks the spot of this is where volatiles should be. And if they're not, this is a substantial null result. And if they're there, that's even more interesting and neat. And we can start looking at the relative composition, like our relative abundance, like I mentioned earlier. And then far right is Amundsen crater here in panel C. I alluded to earlier, this is one of my favorite craters. And one of the reasons it's one of my favorite craters is that a variety of volatiles are potentially stable. CO2 isn't. But again, CO2 is going to be really hard to get to because it's also getting down to these almost 50 Kelvin temperatures, which are really challenging to explore. Whereas Amundsen crater, right at the edge of this permanent shadow here on the right, very quickly turns into temperature regimes where hydrogen cyanide is predicted to be stable. So you can get your organics, your water, and your sulfur. Oh, and the other thing to note is that on the bottom here, sulfur is the most spatially extensive, and everywhere that water, hydrogen, and cyanide and CO2 are present, sulfur can also be stable. Whereas on the right, CO2 is the most volatile. So if a place has predicted CO2 stability, then hydrogen, cyanide, water, and sulfur will also be stable there. So that's why the colors are kind of overprinted in this way. So yeah, so for Amundsen, it's a relatively flat crater floor. There are a lot of smaller craters that you'd have to kind of drive around, but it would be possible to drive into the permanent shadow of Amundsen not very far, have areas where sulfur, water, hydrogen cyanide would be stable, and then you could drive right back out into the sunlit area. So from an exploration standpoint, from an uncrewed vehicle, that would be not a bad place to go look. And other work in the literature also supports this as a really good sample site. So I'm far from the first person to suggest that Amundsen crater is a really neat place to go. I'm just arguing that the diviner data and predicted volatile stability at the surface suggests this is also a really cool place. And then shown here in the red is where the Viper rover is going to land. So we don't predict from the diviner data huge, large-scale ice sheets of water or organics, but there are still some really interesting multiply shadowed areas where we might be able to do that. So what comes next? We've made these predictions. There's been a lot of exploration of in terms of remote sensing. There's also been a lot of theoretical studies about how you could preserve ice sheets that I haven't talked about here. So what comes next? I think one thing that has really consistently thought of over planetary science as a field since the 60s is that we know volatiles could be stable on the moon, but where and how is really challenging. And other than L-cross, there haven't been a whole lot of direct in situ measurements of the chemistry. So what comes next for this study is asking the question if certain volatiles are stable at the surface now, were they in the past? What does this mean for long-term accumulation? Other researchers have kind of looked into what long-term accumulation might mean for volcanic sourced volatiles or other materials. One thing that I'm starting to dig into now is whether or not stability at the surface can be a pathway to bury volatiles. So what I'm looking at now is the annual average temperatures and understanding what that means for water ice stability in the subsurface, along with my diviner team colleagues, and comparing that to the remote sensing of baric hydrogen from neutrons to understand whether or not these pockets below the surface we think are thermally stable actually have hydrogen in them. And yeah, being able to get volatiles from the surface to being able to preserve them is a really big challenge that multiple researchers are working on. But that's kind of the next target for this particular study. But generally though, for lunar polar volatile exploration, a couple big things are happening next. One of them is Lunar Flashlight. It's a small sat that is set for launch in November of this year. We just found out a couple weeks ago that it has a ride to the moon, which is great. This is laser infrared interferometry, which one thing that's unique about this is it's an active source. So the laser is actually going to be turned on. And this is how, if you don't have ambient light or you don't have direct illumination, you can start to do compositional measurements of what's inside some of these PSRs. So that is going to be, pardon the pun, particularly illuminating. Another one is Viper. So this is going to be a rover that is now set for launch in late 2024. It has a 100-day nominal mission, and it has a variety of in situ measurements and a mechanical drill. And so one thing Viper can do at its landing site here, shown in red with my maps overlaid on the topography, is be able to actually look at the composition in kind of like a golf cart size scale. and to really understand then what the local composition and variety and spatial variability of volatiles are, and what that means for potential delivery there. And of course, results from VIPER are going to make us be able to refine these diviner thermal predicted stability maps to really understand how smaller roughness elements and local conditions might affect the long-term volatile stability. And then finally, one thing that's been recent is that Artemis 3, which is going to be hopefully a crewed mission to the lunar South Pole, the variety of different landing locations have been announced. This is not really the down selection, but we're seeing kind of our favorite likely suspects. So one thing to note with this plot is that Shackleton Crater is in the middle here, and Amundsen is over here to the left on the Artemis 3 plot, which means that we are looking from this direction in this map down towards this crater, because Amundsen in this plot is over here. So this is not exactly everyone's favorite cartographic presentation, but it looks really cool here on the right for Artemis 3. But we're seeing a lot of our usual suspects. So there's this peak near Shackleton Crater, which I think is down here. One thing that could potentially be neat is that you could have an instrument that looks into Shackleton Crater without actually having to take astronauts into it. Any of you in the audience have hiked into a Mar crater, or actually more importantly, out of a Mar crater or out of a meteor crater, for example, that can be really hard to do. And so being able to have a thermal infrared instrument might be able to get better temperatures at a smaller spatial scale without actually having to hike in and out. Amundsen Crater rim is here. I think it's kind of in this direction, kind of off my plot. But again, Amundsen, you could be able to look into this or kind of explore the floor. And so, and this connecting ridge here between de Gerlache and Shackleton is kind of this ridge here. This is also a ridge that in the buried water ice papers and in the neutron measurements, there's potentially near surface water ice. So these are all really interesting locations. And like I alluded to earlier, being able to basically dig a soil profile pit would be amazing and would help us understand the not only the relative abundance, but also their spatial distribution at time. One challenge, of course, is going to be that as soon as you uncover some of these volatiles, you're going to start sublimating at different rates. But that starts becoming a more technological challenge in order to get these really valuable scientific results. So one thing that's going to be really important in the future is understanding how to interpret the presence or absence of volatiles, their relative abundance, and their stratigraphic record. What their relationship is from local measurements to remotely sensed data, because as much as I'd like to send 500 VIPER rovers to the moon to sample all the cool locations at the North and South Pole, that's not really technically feasible. Understanding what volatiles co-occur with each other and which ones don't. There's been some recent re-looking at the L-Cross impact plume chemistry data that suggests that particular breakdown of relative abundances could have only been produced by comets, but whether or not Cabeus crater is representative of all the PSRs or not is still an open question. And some of the modeling work that I put references up to earlier in this slide deck suggests that lunar volatile or lunar volcanism could deliver a lot of volatiles to the poles again. So understanding whether or not maybe there's a cometary layer on top of a lunar volcanism layer is really important to understand. It may not be in an area that the VIPER drill can access, but at least the local measurements of temperature and the near surface measurements of relative volatile abundance will help with that. And then of course, this is not going to be ice skating rink level water ice. This is going to have a lot of lunar regolith mixed in with it, a lot of work by Hurley et al. And Cannon et al. In various papers over the last decade have really suggested that micrometeorite bombardment is going to incorporate lithic material into this. So how much is there? Is it in discrete layers? In thinking of discrete layers, can we find a hydrocarbon layer that's indicative of when the Apollo program was happening? Because then you could get a really nice stratigraphic layer of a known date and be able to start backing out long-term accumulation rates here. But again, we won't know until we start turning over rocks and start digging holes whether or not these analyses are going to be possible. Hopefully they are. And then again, to just kind of recap this, the implications for understanding the relative abundance of material and where it is in the stratigraphic record is lunar volcanism. It probably was a huge contribution 3.5 billion years ago, but probably not as much now. Impacts have been sporadic and episodic over the entire Earth-Moon history, but this is something that can still be active in the present day. And then solar wind has just been operating as long as there's been a solid surface in the background, potentially for billions of years. So understanding the relative contributions of sulfur, organics, and water to each other, as well as timing, is going to be critical for understanding which combination of these processes generated that ice. And the most likely answer, and this is the case often in science, the most likely answer is that some combination of these three, rather than just one primarily developing the volatile deposits. But again, until we go sample, we can be surprised, which is a really fun part of science. Okay, and then to bring it back to habitability, this is a very good natural lab for understanding how small bodies could deliver volatiles to terrestrial planet systems, but also the role that interior outgassing plays. The moon has not likely cycled its water through a whole bunch of different things like oceans, or like on the case of Mars, polar deposits or its atmosphere. And so this is a really nice model location and an analog site for understanding how terrestrial planet outgassing and bombardment by small bodies could affect the total source and water budget of terrestrial bodies, as well as understanding where the organics came from. And so I'll just kind of leave us with this conclusion slide, is that the predicted thermal stability of a wide variety of volatiles at the lunar poles has been done. It's roughly consistent with previous work. We're not finding large, like undiscovered potential ice sheets, at least at the surface, at the lunar poles, but there are these kind of outlying areas that are much smaller that are really interesting to potentially go to kind of pick at the history of lunar polar volatiles. And I think one key takeaway from this talk is that in the next 3 years, if someone is watching this talk back on YouTube, the amount of exploration that's going to be going into the lunar poles. I didn't even talk about LUNAMAP, which is a neutron spectrometer that's going to, on a small set, that's going to be taking deep dives close to the lunar South Pole to really improve the neutron spectra, or the neutron data. Things are going to be completely different when we start getting samples back from these particular locations. I think it'll be really interesting to go to some of these locations that are in the diviner predicted thermal stability maps and see what is actually there. And I think in situ measurements are going to basically make this talk seem kind of quaint and redundant in the next couple of years, which is also really exciting from an exploration standpoint, because we're going to be able to start ground truthing these predictions that have been made for decades and have been refined with all this additional remote sensing data. So it's going to be a really interesting time to think about the future of lunar polar volatiles. And I think one key, and I know I'm kind of talking about the future exploration of lunar volatiles instead of the volatiles themselves, but I think one thing to really critically understand is that we are going to be in with either crewed or uncrewed exploration, disturbing some of these really delicate sites. So understanding what that means in terms of where we choose to sample, how we interpret the data is going to be really interesting and particularly challenging. So I'm pretty excited for the next couple of years. And yeah, and I think the more we learn about the moon, the more trickle down there's going to be to understanding terrestrial objects in general. And even though it's not my cup of tea from a research perspective necessarily, I think this has huge implications too for understanding how terrestrial or rocky objects in general evolve and change in our solar system and beyond. So I think with that, I am a little bit past my 45 minutes. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That was really, really cool to see all these data. We have a question in the Q&A, and I know I have a question. I'm sure others will chime in as well. But I'll start with this Q&A question, which is, besides impact events, were there constant redistribution of the volatiles after they were stored in cold traps, e.g. via sublimation redeposition or in regolith transportation? And if so, what might the spatial scale be?
That's a really good question. So the temperatures we picked are so cold that movement of 1 millimeter per billion years is not likely. That being said, you don't instantly go from super cold long-term stability to just no stability at all. So there are these metastable regions likely around these PSRs and cold traps where this is happening. and whether or not that volatile molecule is able to actually make it to the cold trap or gets photodissociated or destroyed some other way before then is a really good question. So yes, processes like this are almost definitely happening. I did not take them into account in these maps. One thing to think about too is you can, of course, mechanically move things in and out of the PSRs depending upon micrometeorite bombardment. A lot of work's been done on that. And whether or not you can bury volatiles fast enough to kind of prevent the micrometeorite bombardment from redistributing them. The answer is it's tough to tell, maybe not, but people are still working on this for exactly this question. And what spatial scale, we're talking about definitely sub-diviner pixel footprint, so less than 300 meters. A lot of this micrometeorite bombardment is much more on the local scale. And it starts also kind of getting into these really small shadows that I think Hain et al. Oh, I can't remember when Paul published that paper. I think it was either 20 or 21. Published this paper looking at kind of subpixel roughness measurements and how they affect shadowing. So yeah, there are a lot of other things that are mechanisms at play, kind of looking at the long-term stability other than just from a thermal perspective. But if it's not thermally stable, it's kind of hard to get it there for a long time. So yeah, there's a lot of interactions. There's a lot in the literature, but I think there's a lot not necessarily known, especially if we're looking at a lot of these craters, like the one shown in this image here, that are potentially quite old. Maybe not, primordial, and definitely not as old and beaten up as in the North Pole. But in the South Pole, there is going to be mass wasting events from crater edges that's going to bury things. So there's a lot of other mechanical and chemical effects that are going to happen once these volatiles are in these thermally stable regions that we didn't take into account in this study, but other folks have.
Raj has a question. Go on, Raj.
Hi, Margaret. Yeah, excellent talk. This might be somewhat of a general question and not exactly specific to this study, but you did mention the potential presence of lunar volatiles that are sort of processed through endogenous processes like volcanism, and then you also have the possibility of comet delivery. Given the volcanism as we know it on the moon has declined significantly through time, and very probably not much going on in the recent times, or probably in the last billion or 2 years as well. So do we expect some sort of stratification wherever you are finding volatiles, like the more recent shallow stuff would be more cometary and so on, and as you may go down, you might find something that is sourced by volcanism? And if so, are there any sort of isotopic measurements like DH and so on as a function of depth, or something that is planned or that has been done that might tell us something about these two sources?
For sure. I think it's very reasonable to expect a stratigraphic history if we really can bury volatiles more quickly than they are lost to space from mechanical mixing or photodissociation, definitely. And it would make sense that the deeper things are more likely to be from lunar volcanism maybe than the shallower things. But I think one really open question is how long is the volatile record preserved at the poles? I would argue that we don't know that definitively, but it's definitely plausible that you could see fine scale layering in some of these deposits that are indicative of maybe volcanism at the very bottom, and then different epochs of maybe cometary delivery in the upper layers. I think isotopic ratios would be really interesting to get. I think maybe a better, or a tracer that might, and I'm not a chemist, so I'm kind of speculating here. I think an easier tracer to measure just might be the sulfur content relative to the water. Because fortunately, lunar volcanism has a lot more predicted sulfur to water than cometary delivery does. And I think that would be a really great first measurement to go, okay, so the things that are buried deeper have more sulfur than closer to the surface. Maybe there was a change in either preservation method, which you'd have to look into, and maybe looking at the regolith content of the ice would tell you something about that. But maybe it was also speaking to a different delivery mechanism, either volcanism or cometary delivery. So I'm trying to think of planned measurements. The Viper drill has a fixed length, and I think it's not particularly deep, and potentially from lunar volcanism, you could potentially be getting meters of ice from that, assuming everything is preserved. So I think it's a really good question. I think we have some ideas about how to answer it, but it's going to take potentially, well, and this is one thing Viper can do, is Viper can do relative chemistry and look at the drill tailings to understand volatile distribution with depth. But again, I think one of the challenges is it's not going to one of these places where we think for a very long period of time it's been very cold. And so we might get an idea of the variation in kind of preservation near the surface of volatiles, but we're not actually going to the place where this is not like the top of like the Greenland ice sheet dome, where you know that you've probably got the most layers from a long-term stratigraphy in it. And so going to one of those places would be a great next step to start addressing some of those things. But yeah, sulfur abundance, I'm sure if you could do D to H, no one would be upset with that. I think it would be a really interesting measurement to take. And I think going to a location where we potentially have one of these really ultra cold PSRs could be a really interesting comparison to Viper, looking at the stratigraphy. At least from a thermal perspective, those are going to be the best preserved. From a mechanical mixing perspective, I mean, impact craters are pretty indiscriminate in terms of mixing. So that might be different. But again, I think these are really great questions that once we start doing some in situ measurements are like the next likely step. So maybe if there's a flight spare Viper, we can send it into Amundsen or send it into one of those 3 craters close to the South Pole and do a measurement like that there.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I have a question that is somewhat close to what Raj just asked. And I apologize because you just said in your answer to him that you don't think of yourself as a chemist. So I apologize if this is getting too chemisty of a question. But when you were talking about volcanic versus comet origin for these volatiles, I also noted that you said, as usually is the case in science, is probably some mixture of these various things. But I mean, I'm a geochemist who thinks about magmas and element cycling in terrestrial systems. And I got to thinking about if there is a potential role for much earlier in the lunar history when there's a lot of bombardment, a lot of remobilization and melting of that thin crust and sort of reworking, if you could have volatiles that were introduced externally, like from a comet, that were then incorporated into a magma that was being generated locally because there was just a lot of bombardment going on, would it be possible to tell if you saw that in a basalt, for instance, if that was comet source or some sort of internally sourced, volatile? What are the methods that people are talking about for? I mean, is it D to H? Is it? I'm not a lunar volatiles person, and I was curious about that.
Yeah. I think the easy way out answer is how confident are we about the late heaven bombardment and the extremeness of the late heaven bombardment, which is a completely different road to go down. I think being able to determine the origin of one exact water molecule is going to be difficult. If there really was a heaven bombardment that was remobilizing magma and it's basically intimately mixed, I think you'd still be able to look at the relative contribution, though, if those organics or some other tracer were able to survive. I think sulfur in the quantity that you'd expect relative to water from lunar volcanism is going to be pretty diagnostic. So I think instead of going, oh, I know the exact origin of this particular water, unless you could do some sort of other isotopic analysis on a whole bunch of them and get a lot of confidence that way, or maybe do some mixing models with regards to that, I think it'd be fair to say you could figure out which method or which delivery mechanism was dominant to the PSRs, but I think it'd be hard to say for sure what the exact origin is. Unless there is some stable isotope chemistry that you could do, which I'm not terribly aware of, I think we'd be looking at relative abundances and being able to come up with the best model. And then, of course, what I didn't talk about here is that once we get samples, that everyone's going to look at their favorite lunar model and go, wait a second, I now have to like match this data point. What do I have to do to my favorite model to be able to match this data point? That will be interesting, and whether or not you need to add a little bit of comments maybe early on in order to keep the magma circulating in enough time. One thing though, I'm going to do something dangerous and see if I can't go back to a previous slide. Maybe this was dangerous. But one of those very early slides looking at the different lunar mare eruptions, these are pretty big volcanic provinces. And the work that's been done by Andrew Wachowski, who also working with Paul Hain at CU, what he was able to do was model, kind of basically take these eruption rates and go, okay, so what amount of water would you expect to get from them? And you can get meters of water. So I think if you had another large cometary impact on top of this, you might be able to see some signal from that comet, but I think it would be far dominated by these individual eruptions. If you have to evoke impacts to get all of these mare basalts going and all the individual eruptions, that might be a different case. But there's a fairly large amount of initial water you can get out of just the mare eruptions that should stick around, assuming that the topography, 2.5 billion years ago was roughly the same as it is now. In terms of actual chemical measurements, I think I'd have to defer back to you, but I think stable isotopes are something likely that is good to do. And again, I don't think anyone, if it's possible, is going to be complain about getting D to H with depth in some of these ice deposits on the moon.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question also, actually following up while you on this slide. Was wondering, and maybe you said it, but I don't remember that. What was the age of those craters which have permanently shadowed regions, and how that compare with this time series for mare volcanism that you're showing here?
So a lot of the ages I don't recall off the top of my head. Part of the challenge is that you of course need to get smaller craters overprinted on them. But based on degradation state, they're not horribly old, but it's not a bad assumption to think that they're probably in the range of billions. Just from their size, you can start making arguments about how frequent these are. So without a radiometric age for them, it's harder to say for sure. You can do superimposed craters as a way of also coming up with dates. But if part of the problem is if they're permanently shadowed, it's really hard to see if there's craters superposing the floor, unless you can kind of look in infrared or some other wavelengths. So the answer is, I'm not sure the precise ages at the South Pole. I'm sure it's possible to do them, but we often assume that this topography was probably set in the first billion years-ish of lunar history. But of course, I think it's an open area for study that if you want to start simulating terrains at the North and South Pole with a bombardment history and seeing how that affects volatile distribution, I think that'd be really interesting. And then the South Pole, though, generally due to the fact that it's sharper relief and less degraded, is younger than the North Pole. But if you look at these North Polar craters, they're quite degraded. So we can definitely do relative ages. The absolute ages without samples, I think, are a little bit dodgier, but I think it's definitely doable. And one kind of outstanding question I have too is, since there are just so few deep craters close to the North Pole, what are the odds of this happening? Are we seeing a really interesting hemispheric dichotomy that's unlikely, or is it likely? And that is not the subject of this talk, but maybe the subject of future work or a lit search I need to do.
Okay, so I don't know how people envision the outgassing related to mare volcanism, whether the volatile atmosphere that would be produced would linger, but I reckon it wouldn't stay around for very long. So I guess if those craters were created after the bulk of mare volcanism happened, then it would just be unlikely that they would receive any mare produced volatiles. Am I making sense?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And the potential tenuous exospheres produced by mare volcanism are very short-lived. The Needham and Kring paper discusses it. The Wachowski et al. Paper discusses that a little bit, and other papers in the literature too. One thing, though, that suggests that a lot of these craters were probably around, though, when a major infilling event happened, is that in the South Pole, this is Rubinenko et al., I think it's 2019 or 2020 paper, found that there are preferentially shallower craters closer to the South Pole in terms of total fraction of craters than in the North. And what they evoked for that kind of shallowing of craters, so basically the depth diameter ratio is smaller the closer you get to the South Pole generally. The reason for that is that they're arguing that they've been infilled by something. And if you have an argument about something being infilled preferentially more towards the poles and the equator, they're evoking infill from volcanic events. So if that is actually correct, then most of these craters that are showing that shallowing depth diameter ratio were probably present whenever that big infill event occurred. Whether or not it was towards the beginning or end of the kind of the Mare volcanism period or not. I think part of the challenge is that enough craters were shallowed that it's less likely that one cometary event kind of like on Mercury could have done it, because we're talking about enough volume of ice that it makes a detectable change in the measured depth diameter ratio of the craters. So that is a line of argument that suggests that at least some of these craters were present at the time the lunar volcanic kind of transient exospheres were around. Then again, maybe it's not volatiles, but I think it's harder to evoke like latitude dependent mass wasting or latitude dependent erosion rates on an airless body. I think water ice is probably the most logical explanation, or some sort of volatile deposit is a more likely explanation. But again, we'll find out when we drill into one of them. That's one nice thing about being able to do some in situ testing in the next couple of years.
Okay, well, cool. Thanks. If I just can follow up with a quick final question on that, at least final for me. You say that we're gonna know more when we drill. Is there any possibility to study those volatiles with sample return, or would it just be impossible to keep those sample cool enough for the volatiles not to go away?
That's a really good question. I mean, not being a sample scientist, of course, I want a cryogenic sample back because I know you can do a lot more in a lab than you can do in situ. Even with a really sophisticated rover. I think you hit the nail on the head though, that keeping it cryogenically cooled is going to be really challenging. Keeping it cryogenically cooled, especially upon like re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere, I think is going to be a pain because you're going to shake it and heat it. And so whatever cooling system you're going to have has to survive that. One thing that's been kind of discussed more generally is that you could slowly heat the sample on the moon and capture the gas, because then it would be in gas phase and you'd know kind of when in the sample or what like delta mass occurred, and you could capture the gas that way. But then again, you've got to get like gas back to the Earth, which is not as easy as a rock. I think there's probably a lot of synergy with the cryogenic comet sample return concepts that have been around, because it would have to travel farther, but then it would also have to do kind of or wouldn't have to travel as far, but it would still have to do the reentry. As far as I'm aware, there's not a selected mission for flight that will do that, but I think that's a very logical next step, because even with really sophisticated rovers or lots of rovers, it's still difficult to do the same kind of chemical analysis you want to do on the Earth, like from a terrestrial lab on the moon. So yeah, I think that's a logical next step. I'm just not sure that I'm not aware of any definitive plans to do that at this point. It wouldn't be easy, but I think sometimes it's helpful for scientists to go, we need this thing, and then the engineers will figure out how to do it. How difficult that is going to be to figure out, though, it's probably not trivial, but it could be really interesting and provide a lot more information in terms of sample return and sample curation too.
Okay, so we need a moon village with lab, right?
Yeah, or I was just thinking it would be so interesting, especially at Johnson there with the sample curation facilities, all of a sudden they have to get cryogenic sample curation. I think that would be an interesting challenge, but if we want to do cryogenic comet sample return potentially on a New Frontiers mission, it seems like very synergistic to be able to kind of like test how to make it work on the moon, where you don't have to go as far to be able to get a second sample if you mess up the first one.
I'm not a mass spectrometer engineer, but wouldn't it be at least somewhat synergistic if your sample was automatically going to volatilize itself if you moved it into the sunlit region where, you know, if you put it in the chamber, right, you have a small mass spectrometer that's set up for measuring things up to sulfur, right? You get your carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and the thing is automatically going to volatilize itself. Maybe that is enough to reduce your energy needs and mean you can make things compact enough. You don't need some sort of ignition source or something to actually introduce a volatile into the mass spectrometer. Maybe somebody can figure that out in the next decade.
Yeah, I think that's one advantage. If you can capture the volatiles and make sure that your system's closed. Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing, right? Is that you don't have to heat a furnace to whatever melting temperature of whatever like basalt thing you're looking at. This is going to be, you just have to move it into the sunlight. From that perspective, yeah, it'll definitely be easier. But I mean, and that comes with challenges too, because then you're potentially having volatile gases in some concentration in a closed chamber. One thing you want to be careful, especially if you start messing around with hydrogen species, is they're not like having too much of a particular volatile somewhere. But again, yeah, I think there's some things that are going to be much easier than we think, and then also just profoundly challenging because it's a new space environment to work in. But again, I think this being able to understand the composition and the origin of lunar polar volatiles gets to so many key questions about how the solar system works that it's not a bad investment to figure out how to do some of these more difficult things.
All right, well, if no one has any more questions, we can thank Margaret for her talk, and I hope you will all join us again next week for the next seminar, which we'll send out an advertising email about. And thank you again, Margaret.
Perfect, thanks so much.